All right, coming down, we have our text area. The main difference with a text area is that the value or the content is going to appear between the tags. So whereas we can hard code the value like we did up here with our name, we could put in Zach and hard code this here. If we wanted to put stuff in with our text area, we'd have to put it between the tags because there's an opening and closing text area here. And we'll look at how to get the value of this later. The only thing that's unique here is we have a spell check option. So misspelled words. Notice that there's no spell correction. However, if we were to take this off or set it to true, notice that that's going to tell us, hey, this word is misspelled. So that's something handy. You may want to turn it off if you find it distracting or hard code that it is on, depending on what you're doing. And then we have our radio buttons. Notice that these are a little bit different. The input and the type is the same for both of these fields. They're both input with type set to radio. But whereas with the drop down, notice how the name is applied to this top level and then the options are only storing values. This is a little bit different with radio buttons. We have the name being the same here. However, the value is different for each one. We could also do these a little bit different and wrap each one in its own label, which is sometimes a little bit easier, and change the name for each one, so the contact preference. So we could go about doing this a little bit differently. I'll just show you briefly. Let's say we had the label for contact preference phone. We wrap that whole thing in it. And then we're going to need to add an ID to tie these together. So the benefit of this is that notice when I click on phone, it selected this radio button. So click on phone and it selects this radio button. But with this way, I don't. And you often see a label up top that will apply to all of the checkboxes below it, or all of the radio buttons, I'm sorry. But notice that there's no ID here. So technically, this label is helpful in that it appears before these following input fields, but there's nothing hard-coded here in this first approach that's telling us behind the scenes or from an accessibility level what this label is actually tied to. So for that reason, this approach here, where you wrap an entire radio button in its own label, is more helpful. So again, this is what you normally see. You see a label up top and then all the radio buttons, but it's better to wrap a label around your entire radio button, or you could simply put it at the end. It'll still work. We could do it this way. However, notice now that the styling is a little bit different because our labels were set to block. So either one of these is going to work, but you'll probably see the label wrapping it a little bit more common, although either one is okay. But you probably want to stay away from this first example of having one label for both of these and then just having the text hanging out there unattached. Notice again that we could pre-check a field as well using the checked attribute. So if I were to move this from one element to the other, and I refresh the page, I'll just put it here to start, refresh the page, and notice it jumps down to phone automatically. So that's the checked, and just like the other attributes that could be used both on their own, they could also be doubled up like this. Again, just because when we start working with the DOM, you'll see that you'll grab the name and then you'll also set the value. So it's kind of duplicate, but that's the reason why for that. Now coming down, we see something new here that we haven't seen before, and that is the required field. This is also new to HTML5, and if we refresh our field, and if we refresh our form and hit submit, notice that it's going to say, please fill out this form. So the browser in this case is doing some simple validation for us. Likewise, if we start to fill this out, and we fill it out with the URL, hit submit, notice that it's going to tell us, hey, this is actually an email. And when this came out with HTML5, it was super exciting because before this, you had to do all of that on your own with JavaScript for every form. And the browser started to realize, hey, this is so common. And the HTML committee started to realize, hey, we need to differentiate forms and offer some more values here. So that's what we see going on. Now, the problem is that if you have JavaScript disabled, this functionality goes away. So for that reason, it's always important, and we'll get to validation later, but you always want to have some server-side validation going on as well. Now, if we come down to our phone, we could see the autocomplete. We have this with the email as well. So if you had your profile saved and just said, hit, yeah, autocomplete this form for me, it would stick your data in there. Then these are just to kind of show you that we have some of these other options. Again, this is JavaScript, but it's the browser implementing it, and it's going to look a little different in every browser. So if you needed a date picker that looked the exact same every single time, no matter what environment you're in, then you probably wouldn't want to use this. You'd want to override it and create your own. But if not, this is something that's super simple because it's going to take you either implementing somebody else's code or a lot of code on your own that you probably don't want to have to write to implement these, and these form values do exist. Coming down, we have the type of range, and notice that we could apply a min and a max. We could set a default value, so I've set it to 10. I could also set a default value equal to 1, and notice it's going to stop down here. And then when I hit submit on the back end, I'm going to get a name recommend, and that is going to, or I could change this maybe to value would be better. Something like that. But this is going to give us a value. Now, notice that it doesn't tell us by default where we're at here. So it would take some custom JavaScript, which we'll look at later, where we could put, hey, you're set to 10, and as they drag this, we could say, hey, update it to tell them where they are. So on its own, it's kind of a little unclear what each value represents or where you are, but we'll learn with JavaScript how to give them some more information in that regard. Okay, so now we come down to file uploads. Super helpful stuff. You'll often have to work with uploading files, and the only thing really special to point out here is the accept parameter. The accept attribute only works when we have the type set to file. However, what it can do is say, hey, only allow for this type of file. And if we click on this, we could see, notice how we can't select our text field, we can't select our SVG, but we can select our HTML file, which is just a simple example file that I've given you in the code to play around with. But you could change this to pretty much any file type. So if you also wanted to accept docs or docs like that, if you wanted to accept PNG files, if you're doing an image uploader or something like that, and you only want them to be able to do JPEGs or PNGs, or you're working with some crazy GIF machine and you only want the GIFs, then you could do that. And they're going to be comma separated. Okay, so we're getting close here. Let's keep on cruising, and let's come down and talk about this option here, the can't touch this field with it set to disabled. So notice that I could highlight this, but I'm going to start typing, and I cannot change this. Also, if I hit submit right now, I got to put in my email. I'm going to hit submit, and notice that up here in the browser we have extra info, and then we have newsletter. Now down here in our form, we have the extra info and we have the newsletter. But notice that our can't touch this form is not being submitted. So this is what disabled does. Disabled does two things. It disables the field from being editable, and it doesn't submit it. Now there's also something called read only. And read only and disabled work the same way as these other ones we've seen. They could work like this, or you could have it just like this. Now, read only is a little bit different. If we refresh our field now, notice I can't edit it. It looks a little bit different, but if I hit submit now, if I fill out my email and I hit submit, notice that up here, we now see extra info, can't touch this, and the value of it, and then the newsletter itself here after.